So, a decade ago, I entered into a short film competition where I made this animation of a fox running through the woods. This was the very first animation competition I ever entered. Now, almost 10 years later, I decided I wanted to remake this shot, but as a 3D and 2D hybrid. I created the fox in Blender, and I digitally painted the backgrounds in Photoshop, and the final composite was put together in Nuke. So as the name would imply, the original competition was to create a short film in 28 days. I found this challenge through Film Freeway, but unfortunately I don't think this competition exists anymore. Film Freeway is a great resource for finding film festivals and creative competitions you can enter your animations in. Make sure to read the rules and entry requirements thoroughly though before entering. And check what the admission costs are, as there is often a fee for these things. I've always loved hybrid animation. Mixing 3D with more traditional forms of animation just excites me so much. I don't know how else to describe my feelings about hybrid animation other than as a chef's kiss moment. My absolute favourite is stop motion and 3D together, a bit like the stuff Leica does. I have mixed 3D and 2D techniques together before, but it's been a long time. 3D software has come so far over the last few years, and having recently seen lots of talented 3D Blender artists on YouTube creating some awesome toon shader effects, I was inspired to take another swing at it, but this time with a more complicated 3D character. So this artwork took me ages. I think I spent the better part of 5 days painting this, and there's no good reason. I'm just really slow at drawing and painting, which is probably why I don't do 2D animation anymore and pretty much just packed it in after university. And you may be asking the very valid question, why not just make this all in 3D? It would have been a lot faster and there'd be no concerns about the background and the fox sitting together perfectly in the scene. Yeah, I think the reality of the situation is I fell into the sunk cost fallacy trap, and the more time I put in, the harder it was to quit. I was also really attached to the idea of making this hybrid animation. I don't know if I would do this again. I think if I was to do it in the future, I would probably just try and purely do it in 3D. But I don't regret doing it either. And there are some things actually, to be honest, that I don't think are 100% achievable in Blender, or if they are, I mean, I would have no idea where to start, because I was really inspired by the artist Arthur Rackham. The stuff I made was quite different really from his, but I don't think I could have got that really illustrative storybook style I was going for in the background if I had purely made it in 3D. I mean, possibly, but it's just all that kind of quite dark line work within it and stuff. I don't know, I think it'd be very hard to control if you were working with a 3D model on that, but I mean, I'm not sure. I haven't really tried, so it's probably possible, but I'm not sure I would have the skills to do it, or if it would even be worth the effort of trying to do it that way. So when I first designed this character, I intended to make the bones and muscles in 3D as well, which I know doesn't make a lot of sense for a cartoony character. The design is very stylized, so why would I try to create this extra level of work for something so far away from anything resembling photorealism? All I can say is I designed this character a long time ago and apparently loved giving myself additional work to do, and I guess I still do. Kind of reminds me of something my driver instructor said to me when I was 17 and learning to drive. I was a super nervous driver, but strangely good at reversing. And one day he said to me I was better at going backwards than I was at going forwards. And this statement has weirdly resonated with me throughout my life. Anyway, when I designed this fox character, I wanted it to look as unthreatening as possible. I wouldn't say super cute though. I was still trying to bring those kind of Rackham vibes into this project. So I ended up landing on this kind of fox/squirrel crossover. It's definitely supposed to be a fox, but it has some very squirrely characteristics. I did the blocking quite fast because I was more just interested in getting on with the sculpting. I only had profile designs. I didn't do a turntable or even a three-dimensional view, mainly because the fox was going to be sideways on for most of the animation anyway, and I knew that at the start because I was obviously recreating this very flat 2D animation. So I wasn't overly worried about how it looked from the front on angle sort of thing. That was one of the first reasons. The second is I feel like I'm okay at this point just working from a single image. Felt like the important shape was coming from the profile, and the rest of it I could sort of just fill in the details once I was in 3D. In the sculpting process, I had lost a lot of the original fox shape, so in edit mode, I just pulled the shape back out using the soft selection tool. I modelled the front legs a lot more carefully this time after my spectacular attempt. I mean, look at those. Poor fox, I really did a day. I made sure they were a lot closer to the position where they were supposed to be, then jumped back into sculpting. I found the sculpting really challenging on this build. I think this is due to being new to the software, and I relied a lot more heavily on the sculpting tools in Blender for this character than I did in my previous video. It was a real struggle to get the model looking anything close to my original designs, but it does eventually get there. I almost started again at this point, and I've cut it out of the video, but this was actually my second attempt at sculpting the fox. I was determined to get better at sculpting in Blender though. I didn't want to tighten the model any more than I already had, as I'd seen other 3D artists just lay down the basics in modelling and then use the sculpting tools in Blender to manage most of the build. And having previously used ZBrush, I wanted to see if I could accomplish this as well, hoping that in the long run this would make me a faster organic modeler in Blender. My approach when I was sculpting this was I was going quite heavy with defining areas, a lot more than I would actually want the fox to look like in the end, but the intention was to sort of soften them later because I was just trying to get the shapes where I wanted them, and then I would sort of smooth it out as I went. I put a bit of consideration into the shader at this point because obviously I was thinking about how the light was going to fall on it, because that would really make a difference to how readable it was, but at the same time I haven't used the Blender Toon shader before, so I wasn't 100% sure how it would kind of come out, but having used the Arnold Toon shader in Maya, I sort of had an idea of how it might work. I then removed some geometry as she needed a clean topology, as I'll be animating her later. I did try some of Blender's tools to simplify the geometry, but everything I tried just messed the topology up and it wasn't really worth it. It was at this time that quad remesher add-on was looking more and more appetizing. So I'm rendering this in Eevee so I can use this shader to RGB to create that kind of toon shader look with a ramp node on constant. I also used a displace modifier. I linked the displace modifier to null object. I did this because I thought about maybe animating that as well to make it look more natural, but I think it was just a bit too much noise with it moving as well at the same time, because the fox is already moving through the scene, so you already get a bit of just displacement happening anyway on it as it moves. I watched a few other YouTubers to figure out what would be the best way to get the outline I wanted. I tried a few techniques, including the grease pencil for the outline, but settled on the solidifying technique for this build. I've dropped in the description all my references for this video, but I will do a quick overview on how to do this technique as well. So I used a solidify modifier, set the offset to 0, turned off rim fill, flipped the normals, set the material offset to -100, created a new material for the outline and made sure it was in slot 1 in the material outliner. I just used a RGB node straight into the material output for the outline material and turned on all back face culling for all options in the material properties. I used a very heavy black outline aesthetic just to try and match the background. To be honest, I think the fox in a lot of ways look better without this kind of really dark black in the shader. So where the shadows are, it's all, this kind of solid black sort of thing, but I needed that thickness to match what was going on in the background. But I do think if it wasn't for the background, I wouldn't have chosen that aesthetic. Making sure it worked with the background was one of the most important parts of this creation. I didn't want to look like a 2D background with a 3D fox stuck on top, and now I was at the stage of bringing the background and fox together. I was a bit nervous if it would come together or not. I'm pretty happy with how the fox ended up sitting in the scene. I think aesthetically it kind of worked. Yeah, I definitely had a lot of doubts when I was putting the scene together, but once I kind of saw the just the background with the fox in the foreground before I sort of put all the layers in, I sort of thought, oh yeah, it's probably gonna look alright. I left this big space between the foreground and the background because I knew I was gonna put a floor in 3D. I just did this because it was easier. And when I originally came up with the idea, I wanted the snow to interact with the paw prints. But unfortunately, due to the toon shader and the solidify modifier, it didn't really work. I switched out the point lights for the directional light because I did think about tracking the point lights to the fox. You can link lights in cycles, but you can't do it in Eevee. And I think I just kind of forgot that you couldn't do that. Whatever lights I had in the scene would have to work in the whole scene, and otherwise it just was kind of weird that these lights were just following the fox around, so wherever the fox went, the lights would change with it. So I decided just to put a directional light in, so the whole scene would be affected the same. I just changed the background trees colours a bit just to sort of match the snow a bit better. I do most of my colour correction later on in comp and stuff, but I just thought I would do a bit now because I could see that there was an issue with it. I don't know how many times I've said this, but this is also my first time in Blender rigging something, and I've rigged before in Maya. I haven't done a huge amount of rigging, but I've done a little bit. And I did think about putting IK handles in as well, just to speed up the animation and the leg and tail posing, but I didn't in the end, mainly just because I thought it's literally just using this fox for this kind of one quite short piece of animation. I didn't think it was worth sort of going through the hassle of learning how to do that properly. To be honest, I did sort of regret not doing it when I was animating it, because it definitely made the animating, which I'm also already not great at, a bit more challenging. The weight painting in Blender is quite similar to Maya. It still has those kind of bits which I find kind of annoying, that are a bit buggy and they just will not blend out for whatever reason. But that happens in Maya as well, so nothing new. But yeah, weight painting was fine, it's basically the same. I found rigging in Blender interesting. I still have a lot to learn, I think, about that. And I ended up just putting controls for all the bones because I wasn't sure how to hide the bones and I couldn't be bothered to look it up. But I also think I just put too many bones in it, to be honest. I didn't need that much control over the motion. But I was thinking more realistically how many bones, but actually that was just pointless. I really should have been thinking, which bits of this do I want to move? I was pretty happy with the character once it was rigged overall. And like I said, it would have been better if it was just a little less complicated, and if it had some IK handles just to make animating the legs and the tail a bit easier. That would have been nice, but next time, gotta leave room for improvement. And then I was on to the animating, and oh my god, animating again. It's been a hot minute since I animated a character. I generally avoid it at all costs these days. Anyway, I found some reference of a fox doing a little speedy trot on YouTube. I edited and stabilised the footage, then threw it onto a reference plane in Blender, then tried to animate my rigged critter. I did the reference this way just to make it as easy as possible to animate. I thought if I had direct reference right behind it, it would make it easier, and I mean it does make it easier, but maybe also a little bit messier because I was trying to create a perfect loop, and then I could just loop it and then drag it across the scene, which is essentially what I ended up doing. I didn't animate the fox running like I did in the original shot, just because I wanted it in the shot for longer, and obviously what I could have done is done a walk cycle instead, but I felt that the quicker it moved through the stage, the less likely people would be to notice the animation issues. So even though I went for a slightly slower animation because I wanted it to be on screen for longer, I also didn't really trust that I would do a very good job on a walk cycle, so I sort of went in between. I just sped up the footage quite a bit here, as it took me a fair while to do. Like I said, I'm a pretty weak character animator. My general approach is use reference and pray to the animation gods that it looks half decent. The main challenges of animating in Blender are the same challenges I have animating in any software, and that is just not really my thing. But also, I think with anything like this, when you don't know the software super well, everything just takes a bit longer. I'm not sure if there's much I could do to speed up the animating process other than just practice it more. I think with animating, especially like character animation, it really is just a skill that you develop the more you do it. Most really good animators I know, not exclusively, but most of the ones I do know, their main thing they do is animating. It's like such an art to be good at it and to do it quickly. After I'd made the basic walk cycle loop, I thought the best approach was to add as much movement as possible to the rest of the character to sort of cover up my subpar animation, which honestly, it did help quite a lot. Also adding things like ear and head animation really helped give my little fox a bit of character. So anyway, onto the 3D snow simulation. To be fair, this wasn't too difficult to manage. It's a pretty simple effect, and it's quite simple to how Maya works. It's basically a plane with a particle emitter, just chucking out one type of geometry. So I could have done this effect in Nuke instead when I was compositing, and I did consider it, and if it was difficult, if I was struggling to do it in Blender, I probably would have done it in Nuke. The main reason I didn't want to do it in Nuke is Nuke tends to get quite bogged down with trying to render 3D elements. I like to, if I can, keep my Nuke kind of composites like streamlined as possible. Like if it can be done in 3D, I'd rather do it that way, because I mean, one, you do have more control actually in 3D, but then also you don't get like really bogged down in the comp stage, which means you can sort of see what's coming together a lot quicker. Also, you know, I figured the main things I'd want to do is just like change the color and stuff like that, which is easy to do if you do a Cryptomatte pass. So I made it look very simple just because I thought it would fit in more. Like I didn't want to make something really complicated and CGI looking when I was going more for an illustrative, traditional look. I knew I wanted snow in it, but I couldn't think of anything that would work more effectively than just kind of literally just dots. I thought if I did something complicated that looked like, I don't know, snowflakes, or made them, you know, sort of wispy and things, that it might end up just looking like a 3D effect on top of a 2D illustration. I added the fog just for additional atmosphere in the scene, but also to partly cover up those legs where the animation wasn't great. I sort of thought maybe a bit of fog would help with that. I painted the fog in Photoshop and then brought it into 3D just to help keep with this sort of more, you know, 2D kind of look. But then I used a displacement on it to animate it in 3D. So it still had movement in it, but it looked more 2D than it would have done if it was just like using a volume in Blender. I added a lot of elements to the scene just to make it interesting and dynamic, but also probably partly to cover up the animation a bit as well, because like I've said, it's one of my areas where I'm weaker. So I sort of thought if I had lots of other elements and things going on, it might help distract a bit from the not so great animation. My favourite software to composite in is Nuke. Apologies in advance, I know it's not cheap software or free like Blender, but I just love Nuke. I've been using it since I switched from a 2D artist to VFX and 3D artist, and I just don't think I can give it up. It's like a warm blanket, and it is fantastic software. It also now has a plugin for Unreal Engine that's pretty powerful, so if you're an Unreal artist, that's great as well. It does also have a free option, which is the Nuke non-commercial license, which unfortunately does have quite a few limitations. I personally use the indie license, which is still pricey, but it's much cheaper than their professional license, which until a few years ago was all they had. The main elements I composited in Nuke was the depth of field and atmosphere. This is all driven using the Z depth pass. I actually created a video on how to do all this within Blender and Nuke. I also used the Cryptomatte pass to separate the snow effects so I could add a slight glow. I'm intending to create a tutorial on what passes I would recommend for a Blender to Nuke pipeline and how to use them. So if you're watching in the future, there might be a video linked up here to a tutorial. I will also pop all relevant tutorials in the description. I also put the fox animation on 2s. I did this just to make it look more traditional. Most of the time 2D animation is on 2s. This is just done to reduce the amount of work that goes into animating. I did a lot of things like adding motion blur, which actually kind of reduced the visual clarity of the scene, but I did this because I felt that it helped bring the whole scene together and meant that the fox sat in the shot a bit better, because that was like one of my main concerns, is that the fox would just really stick out like a sore thumb. So I was sort of doing things that I was hoping would help the scene really come together. I chose a different season to the original fox just to make it a bit different, try something new. I mean, maybe in 10 years time I will do a fox in spring, see how far I've come. I just used the color correct to pull out the highlights and edit the ranges until I was happy with what it was picking up, then played with the contrast and gain values. Finally, I added a vignette and called it a day. I didn't go heavy with the grading at this point. I generally like to leave a large color range for flexibility, then throw on a heavier grade in the edit stage, so it's easy to change if I'm not happy with it and I don't have to keep going back and forth between editing and compositing. It was really nice at this stage just to do something I feel comfortable in. This shot ended up being very challenging for me. I didn't really consider how much I would have to learn and was overly optimistic about the areas that I knew weren't my strengths. But with that said, I learnt loads for this process, and Obviously, it's good to push yourself in areas you're less comfortable in. If you are interested in my process in Blender and how I tackle more complicated character modelling, I recommend you check out this video on how I created my first character in Blender. Anyway, thanks so much for watching and hope to see you in the next one.